coming this afternoon, you guys. My name's Nicole. I am from the Campbell Union School District, which is actually in the San Jose area. So I drove up this morning, but I was telling these people over here, I think I grew up in Yuba City, born and raised. My parents live there, my siblings still live there, so CapCUE is a special place in my heart, and the CapCUE folks are always super fun. So I made the long trek this morning to come to Tech Fest just for that reason. So like I said, I'm Nicole, I'm from Campbell. I'm actually in Equity TOSA, which you can ask me, it's a really long what it actually is, but I'm based at a middle school, and I just do things like this for fun because it's what I believe in. I believe in good pedagogy. And I first learned about HyperDocs, I think maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and it's just, I just am so passionate about the good pedagogy behind it and the good lesson design and instruction that it just kind of infiltrates everything I do. And I like to spread the gospel. So that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm talking to you about HyperDocs. So before we get started, I would just like to read the room a little bit about your knowledge of HyperDocs coming into today. So if you can just give me like a fist to 5. Do you know about fist to 5, where you like rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 5 of your knowledge of HyperDocs? So a 0 being today is the first day you've heard of HyperDocs, or like I heard of them, somewhat familiar, all the way up to regularly using them, or you could get up here and lead the session. If you could just give me a rating scale. Perfect, perfect, 2s and 3s. Great, good, then we're on track with kind of what I have for you today. Awesome, thanks for doing that. Okay, so I'm gonna start off on my soapbox a little bit for you. So this session is be a HyperDoc hero and save the instructional day. And I apologize if it's too dark, but you'll get to see him in a minute up close. So when I look at this GIF of 1960s Batman, it's a little bit metaphorical for me of education, because at the time, 1960s Batman was probably pretty cutting edge, super engaging for the kids who watched it, like kind of nothing of its time, right? So we as educators, when we come into our classrooms, we bring with us our own nostalgia, our own story, our own educational experience. But for our students, this is not their Batman. This is their Batman. So when we approach education, if we're approaching education with our version of it, or the education version we received, and this is the version that our students, that is their reality, then we have a disconnect. So when we are planning our instruction, we need to be planning for this Batman and not 1960s Batman. So a history of education 101, education 101 with you for a few minutes. At turn of the century education, or education of the past, kind of was probably something similar to this, with these schoolhouses, desks in rows. The teacher was the holder of all knowledge, and students were expected to be obedient and subordinate, right? You couldn't get in trouble at school. You were expected to obey and comply. And the reason for that was because we were preparing students for careers, as we've always been. Like, the term career readiness is not a new thing. We've always been preparing kids for careers. But they were just more jobs like this, like Henry Ford's assembly lines and factory work, and jobs where they were going to be compliant and subordinate. It's not what our kids need now. At the time, this was appropriate because we were preparing our students for these types of careers. Today, and our kids of the future moving forward, we're preparing them for more things that look like this, right? When you think of our students in our seats today, we talk about things like collaboration and critical thinking. That was not something that turn of the century classrooms valued or even incorporated. You weren't allowed to talk to other kids in the classroom back, in the good old days, as they call them. So when we're thinking about that, when we're preparing our students, we're picturing a future like this for them, and not gonna get there by teaching them this way. Kapow. So in order to prepare our students for those futures and those 4 pictures I've showed you, we have to step up our game a little bit when it comes to what we give them with instruction. All right, so enter HyperDocs now. Let me make the connection with HyperDocs. So for HyperDoc newbies, the technical definition of a HyperDoc is it's an interactive Google Doc that changes the worksheet lecture method of delivering instruction. But it's more than that, and actually to define a HyperDoc is a little bit tricky, because to me a HyperDoc isn't really a thing. It's not like a noun. It's more a mindset and an approach to planning your instruction. So I'm going to go a little bit into that and give you some examples. So these three ladies are the inventors, the creators of HyperDocs. You may have seen their names before or seen them at other conferences. Lisa, Kelly, and Sarah, they are three TOSAs out of the Pleasanton area. Well, they used to be. Kelly's an assistant principal now. But they are the creators of HyperDocs, and they've been talking about HyperDocs for quite a few years now. And through their work, they've started to grow their HyperDoc community, and they have a lot of HyperDoc stuff out there, resources for people to access who are using HyperDocs in their instruction. So their website is hyperdocs.co, not .com, hyperdocs.co, and today we'll get some time to go into that because it's a really valuable website. It has a ton of resources such as sample HyperDocs and templates that you can use, and how-to guides, and some of their favorite tools they like to do when they create HyperDocs. But in addition to HyperDocs, and maybe what's become my favorite part of HyperDocs is the HyperDoc community. So myself and really dozens and hundreds of other teachers have all kind of connected through this HyperDoc community, which is Teachers Give Teachers. The whole philosophy behind HyperDocs is good pedagogy for my kids, but not just for my kids. Like, your kids also deserve it, and your kids deserve it, and your kids deserve it. So when we put ourselves together and freely give each other our lesson design, all our kids benefit from it. So that's what the Teachers Give Teachers community is all about. So on the hyperdocs.co website, there's a Teachers Give Teachers section, and you can freely search through people's HyperDocs that they've submitted to the Teachers Give Teachers community. And you too can submit your own too. And they don't have to be amazing or fabulous or final products or whatever, because the great thing is you can see someone's idea and take it and make it your own. Like, you may see somebody and be like, oh, that's a good idea, and then remix it and use it with your kids. So later on today, you'll get some time to explore that. There's a Teachers Give Teachers community all through Twitter. If you're not on Twitter, and if you are like I was, which is like Twitter's for celebrity drama and selfies and things like that, you're missing out on a whole subculture of educators that connect through Twitter chats, through like the CapCUE PLN, and the Teachers Give Teachers community, for example. All of my HyperDoc pals I met through Twitter. So we don't see each other in person very often, other than like things like this, but we connect regularly and share through Twitter frequently, weekly sometimes. So give Twitter a chance, especially if you do it with a purpose. And check out Teachers Give Teachers on Twitter. Twitter can be like a search engine too. Did you know you can just search Twitter like you can search Google? You can just go on Twitter without an account and search HyperDocs. So during playtime today, you can check that out. But if you're more of like a Facebook person, there's an active HyperDoc community on Facebook too. Actually 13,000 members in the Facebook group, which that's doubled from this time last year. Last year at Fall CUE, I went on there and it was about 7,000 members, and it's doubled since then. And that's people worldwide. And it's actually, for being a Facebook group with that many people, it's one of the nicest communities I've ever seen. And it's a really positive place, and it's a good place to go just to kind of explore and get your feet wet, and check out what kinds of stuff people are creating. So if Facebook is your jam, you can join the HyperDoc group today and just kind of explore around. I encourage you to do so. You can interact with people that are on there too and see what you can find. Okay? So I'm talking about instructional shifts for just a moment and how HyperDocs come into play. So this is what traditional teaching model looks like, right? That black and white picture I showed before, where the teacher is at the front of the classroom, holder of all knowledge, and disseminating information to their students. Sometimes it's called like the sage on the stage, right? You're on stage like I am right now, performing for you, and students, you are sitting there and passively just receiving, possibly. Who knows what else is going on, but no judgment. But in a traditional classroom, this is the flow of learning. It looks like that. Sometimes teachers get creative and put your kids in groups, but even then, most of the time, the information's still coming from the teacher. It's just going to a group, and it's going to a group instead of in the single rows. Come on in, it's okay. So the cycle of learning in a traditional learning model would be something like this. You would explain the learning to the student, usually through lecture model, like what I'm doing right now. Whole class instruction, I'm telling you what we're learning about today. Then comes the apply section, where students apply their learning, usually through a worksheet and usually through homework. So I taught you something, now you're gonna go do it on a worksheet, and then you're gonna practice it at home on homework. And then the last step of this process is to assess your learning, usually through a test, but maybe through a project of some type at the end. So this is like a traditional cycle of learning that I certainly used for many years as an educator, truth be told. And that supports this model of instruction, where the teacher is the holder of the information and is giving it, bestowing it upon these students, and then testing to see did they learn it, and if they didn't, we have to move on because we have all these other standards to get to and testing and things like that. Here in the 21st century, which cracks me up because we're almost 20% into the 21st century now, but I don't know, it's not like this futuristic thing like it sounds, it's today. But the futures that we want our students to be prepared for, we need to be preparing them in ways like this in our classroom, where it's not just the teacher and the arrows pointing one way, but you can see in this diagram, which I found on this website, it's pretty awesome. It may not look perfectly like this, but the concept of it is there, where students are learning from each other, or students are learning not from the teacher, but from curated resources, and then the teacher is just kind of hummingbirding around all these different learning opportunities and facilitating, making sure that bad words aren't said, that sort of thing. But this is where the learning is happening, is in different stations in the room, not just I'm up on stage giving it to you. So in the HyperDoc cycle of learning, instead of just starting with I'm going to tell you what we're learning, there's an explore element. So I can create the resources and give them to you. So instead of telling you we're going to learn about the gold rush, you're going to go on this thing I've created and you're going to explore the gold rush resources I've curated. Or you're going to watch this YouTube video about miners in the 1840s. Or you're going to go to this awesome website that's interactive and learn about early settlers. So piquing students' interest and making them actually a little bit curious about what we're going to learning, instead of sitting there like, take out your notebook, we're going to take notes on the gold rush, engages their brains and actually makes them more participating in their learning now with an explore element. Then once we've explored it, then we can move into the explain piece. But rather than me standing up here lecturing to you about explain, which like honestly there's a time and a place. I'm not bashing whole class instruction because it's necessary sometime. Not always, it just always shouldn't be the only way that we teach, but sometimes. But explain can also look like, I made a screencast video of how to write an introductory paragraph, and you can go watch it while I work directly with these students who need my attention a little bit more. That can be how I teach you how to write a paragraph. Or maybe there's a really awesome website out there that can explain how to multiply fractions way better than I could. So I can give my students that website to go learn how to multiply fractions. And I can just be facilitating, or like I said, go sit next to my non-English speaking student and help that person one-on-one through this lesson. So now the learning is in students' hands because I created it for them ahead of time. And then it frees me up from the front of the stage to go where the learning is actually happening, where I'm needed actually the most, instead of being up here talking to everybody all at the same time. After you explain it, then we want students to apply their learning. What do you want your kids to do with what they've just learned is the biggest thing missing from that traditional learning model. So before that old model where it was learn it and then we assess them, we need to have something in between now, is what do you want them to do with this knowledge that you just got them to go find and learn? How are they going to apply their learning? And then from there, it can really go on to other things. Maybe once they apply their learning, it leads them back to explore a new topic. Or maybe they explore a new topic and they show you through pre-assessments that they already know about that, and they can skip that whole explain piece and go straight to apply. Like, I already know how to multiply fractions, so I don't actually need to do the practice problems, but I can apply it through some cool project that the teacher has created for me It doesn't always have to go this way. And it doesn't have to go any way. It could go back and forth all which way. Maybe after they apply, we have to add layers to it. So the point of it is that's a cycle. It's not that linear thing that I showed before in the traditional model. The HyperDoc cycle of learning even adds a little bit more to it. So we have like an engagement piece factored in addition to the explore. And we have, after they apply their learning, they share it with each other. They share it with their classmates, or they share it with a global community or a partner class. And then the built-in piece of reflection is huge. When they go back and look at what they learned and do that metacognition piece, that's very different than traditional learning models. And I think one of my favorite pieces about HyperDocs is the built-in extension component, because we all have those students or have had those students in the past where they blow through your lesson and they're done with it while your other students are just getting started and you're like, now what do I do with you? And then they're usually the kids that are gonna disrupt your class and be super loud because they're done and they already learned it. So with a HyperDoc, I can automatically build in these open-ended extended learning opportunities right there for them, and they're engaged. In the packaging of your HyperDoc, which I'll go into for a second, you can address all of your learners' needs in one pretty little thing, and then when they're done, it's self-directed. They know exactly what to go work on, and it's there. It's not something like, oh, then you can go play cool math games or something like that. It's intentional, and it's enriching, and it's good instruction, and it's engagement in learning for them. So this is a cool visual from my friend Misty. She's here today. She presented last session. That just kind of visually explains the concept of that shift I was talking about from traditional instruction to a transformative instruction, especially through a tool like using HyperDocs. We're moving from this like teacher-directed, we're all doing the same thing, to more differentiated with flexibility built in. Curating resources and using what you know to more personalize the learning experience for all your learners in your class. So I like that. I just mentioned packaging a minute ago. What I mean by packaging, and I'll show you today if you're not familiar, if you haven't seen too many HyperDocs, is what it visually looks like to the student and how you curate all of your resources and your activities and your learning, what it looks like. And HyperDocs don't have to just be a Google Doc. HyperDocs are also on Google Slides or a Google site. Those are also HyperDocs. It's just about what tool you decide to package your lesson in so that it has good organization and that the intention behind it is that inquiry learning and that HyperDoc cycle that I mentioned before. So the term HyperDoc is why I said it's not even really a Google Doc sometimes. Maybe your HyperDoc is on a slide or on a Google slide deck. So when you get to explore today, maybe you'll see some examples of non-Google Doc HyperDocs, or you'll kind of see how packaging plays into your lesson design. So here's an example of that, what I mean by packaging. So this is an example syllabus from an AP World History Summer project. Okay, so project requirements, here are the books, here's the assignment due date. I've made many a syllabus like this before in my life, right? Through HyperDocs though, I can package this to make it look more something like this. More visually exciting to look at, first of all, for what AP World History, so a 15-year-old kid, to look at this versus that. But also, look at, rather than this title and this ISBN number to a 15-year-old, I can just give them the link right here to maybe that's to Amazon, or maybe it's to like a book trailer on YouTube for it, or read reviews about the book. And then they can click externally to other places, like to read the requirements for the project there, and then a spot to capture their thinking about that book. Maybe it's a Padlet I've set up, or maybe it's a whole class Google Doc where everybody can kind of jump in and add their thinking. So this is way more interactive and engaging than this 8.5 by 11 words on paper, I mean. So when I say packaging, this is kind of what I'm talking about. These are just watch outs that myself, I feel responsible to bestow onto you as new-ish HyperDoc people so that you can do HyperDocs correctly. Because whenever there is this blended learning or fancy tool, it comes with an element of things that could go awry. So I call these HyperDoc supervillains because we're here for be a HyperDoc hero. So my supervillain number one is requesting access on a HyperDoc. So let's say you search for 7th grade science and you find this amazing plate tectonics HyperDoc another teacher made and openly shared freely. It's in view only mode. So that teacher put it in view only and is sharing it with you. So when it's in view only, we tend to go, oh, I need to edit it so I can use this for my class. Don't do that. Everybody repeat after me. File, make a copy. File, make a copy. One more time. File, make a copy. File, make a copy. Thank you. Friends don't let friends request access, because when you request access to a HyperDoc, that is basically the same thing as taking a master copy of a piece of paper and writing on it. You're changing the master copy. For you to use my HyperDoc with your kids, you go to File, Make a Copy, then you have your own editable version of that HyperDoc that you can do whatever you want with. Also, File, Make a Copy. Teach your students not to request access as well, because my email looks like this sometimes too. I can always tell when someone's class is working on one of my HyperDocs, because these are all students that are requesting access. So teach your students good digital citizenship too. They shouldn't just be blindly requesting access on anything in the first place. And if there is a problem with the link, they should work it out with you, not send it into the internet abyss. It was a doc that looked like this. They didn't even need editing access to that. It was just information, but they were still just clicking request access anyway. So part of it is teaching your students to be responsible, but also file, make a copy. Okay, supervillain number two is not giving credit to the original creator. So if you are searching around for HyperDocs and you find a cool one you want to use, we refer to that as remixing. So you are more than welcome to take one of my HyperDocs and file, make a copy and use it with your students. Just make sure, good digital citizenship, you're giving credit to the person who created it. And if your students ask you, like, who is Miss Marshall or who is Mr. Fahey, you can tell them it's this teacher who created this lesson, who openly shared it, and I get to use it with you because it's awesome. Or if you make some modifications to it, you can just put it in there. Like, you can see there are some that are remixes of remixes of remixes. That's just good lesson design. It's 3 teachers not in the same room, not even the same part of the country even, collaborating on this really awesome lesson plan. So it's kind of cool to show that for your kids. Just make sure that you don't delete the original person's name, because that is a lot of hard work that they put out there for free, and just give credit where credit is due. Calling a doc with links a HyperDoc. I would say this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions of HyperDocs, and maybe you're sitting there trying to clear this up yourself. A HyperDoc is not a digital worksheet. It's not a doc that has links embedded into it. It's more than that. It comes back to that lesson design that I was talking about before. That's really what makes a HyperDoc and not just a doc with links or a digital worksheet. It's the intention behind it, it's the pedagogy, and it's the lesson planning. The doc itself with the links and stuff in it, that's just the tool. But it's the idea, the creation of the whole lesson, and that piece, like I said before, what do you want your students to do with that learning, that makes it a HyperDoc. So this is a great chart made by Carly Mora. She's another HyperDocer in the HyperDoc community. And in the exploration time, you'll get to read this up close if you need more help with the what's the difference piece. So I'll give you access to that in a second. In just a few moments, you're going to get the link to go explore. These are 2 resources, well, 3 resources that I wanted to highlight for a moment. The HyperDoc handbook I meant to bring with me today and forgot is, do you have it? I do have it. It's a phenomenal resource. I don't usually buy edu books anymore in hard copy version, but this one I do because I still regularly flip through it and refer back to it. So if you're looking for an investment and you're serious about your HyperDocing, I recommend that. Myself and these other awesome folks, this is on the HyperDoc YouTube channel, and it's just a conversation with the HyperDoc ladies about our process about creating HyperDocs. So if you're interested in kind of hearing what goes into the thought behind creating HyperDocs, you could explore that. This, though, is worth the cost of admission alone. The HyperDoc Bootcamp, I did this a few summers ago, and it's a really, if you want to get in-depth, one-on-one with the creators of HyperDocs and build HyperDocs from the inside out and kind of get deep into that pedagogy that I was going into before, this is worth it. It's the best PD I've ever done. And it's kind of self-paced too. You don't have to do it at any certain time. And Lisa, Kelly, and Sarah run it, and it's done, I mean, it's global. People participate from all over the world on these different boot camps. So look into it. They do a few throughout the year. Maybe now's not a good time because it's October. Maybe that's like, you're like, too much. Usually there's one in the summertime too, which is when I did it, and I could really kind of focus on it. But so just stick that in your back pocket. Okay, this is the link to the slides I just showed you. So if there's anything you wanted to like show anybody after you leave today or come back to, it's case sensitive. It's bit.ly HyperDoc Hero with the capital H, D, and H. And then I'm going to give you a second link in just a moment to Playtime. And I'm just going to briefly show you what's going on there and then let you go at your own pace of what you want to explore. On the rabbit hole, let me just kind of show you a little bit of what's on here. Remember, anything you see, just remember to file, make a copy. There's just a little bit of an overview of some of my HyperDoc heroes, people that are excellent to follow or connect with. There's links to what I could find of all of their resources to explore through. These are active links now to those two resources I talked about, the boot camp and the YouTube channel and the HyperDocs.co website. Here's Carly's what's the difference between a HyperDoc and a doc with links. And then after that, it's just resources and resources and resources. Here, I made a HyperDoc called How to HyperDoc. So if you wanted to roll this out with your students and explaining a HyperDoc with them, this is what I do when I share a HyperDoc on Twitter. This is a whole novel HyperDoc I made for this whole book. This is a 6-week lesson. I actually left it for my sub when I went on maternity leave. Easy peasy. And then tons of other stuff, just collections. Here are Padlets on Padlets on Padlets of HyperDocs for you to just like, that's why I call it a rabbit hole, because you're just gonna start clicking. If you're using like a novel HyperDoc, here's a template. And then I made some screencasts of how to search and find HyperDocs in different places. So there's no sound, it's just like a click-through guide. So how to search the teachers, give teachers section of the website, how to search on Twitter, and then how to search the Facebook group, and then how to use the templates. All right? So if you want to click around and play, if you see anything good, I highly recommend making a copy of it, because you may not navigate your way back to it later or bookmark it or something. All right, down the rabbit hole you go.